think we're going to get started. It's been a wonderful almost day and a half so far. It's been really great to be back in person at OAIA, see some familiar faces and friends and contacts, and make some new contacts and friends. I know we had a nice time last night at the social event, and it's just really great to be together. It's also been really inspiring as always. Just there's so much great sharing taking place. I always come away feeling quite energized about environmental assessment and planning type work, and feeling that I have lots to think about and carry forward into the work that I do. So I'm a moderator and a speaker today, but our theme for session number 6 is perspectives on the future. And we have a really great panel here of 4 presenters who are going to share some of their work focused on tools and methods and practices related to environmental assessment. The first of which I'd like to invite Eve McLeod-Norberg to come to the stage. She's from University of Waterloo, and she's going to give us a presentation on a sustainability assessment framework to guide decision-making about rare earth element mining. So please welcome Eve.
Forward and backwards. I can do that. Good morning. So my name is Eve McLeod-Norberg. I am a master's student at the University of Waterloo right now. I study social and ecological sustainability, but my background is in geology. So naturally, I continued on studying rocks. So my research has been to design a sustainability assessment framework for rare earth element mining, but more specifically, rare earth element mining in Canada. So what are rare earths and why do we care about them? Well, I know you guys have all heard critical minerals thrown around a little bit over the last couple of days and probably in the news over the last couple of years. We're going to do a little bit of audience participation right now. I'd like to see a show of hands who here has a smartphone on them. Cool. Who owns either a hybrid or an electric vehicle? Okay, and who gets some portion of their electricity every month, either from solar, from wind, or from nuclear? Great, that's probably most of you. So all of you guys, you all depend on rare earths on basically a daily basis to live the way that you do. So rare earths are a group of 17 elements. These include the lanthanide group on the periodic table, as well as scandium and yttrium. They're used primarily in 3 main areas. These are electronics, defense, and most importantly, renewable energy. So wind turbines, solar panels, nuclear energy, LED lighting, and hybrid and electric vehicles all require rare earth elements for production. To meet the goal set out in the Paris Agreement of 1.5 to 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, we will need to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And with 73.2% of greenhouse gas emissions currently emitted by the energy sector, the transition to renewable energy production and making sure that the materials required for this transition are available should be one of our top priorities right now. So projections anticipate global shortages of rare earth elements by 2030 due to an extreme increase in demand and a lack of systems in place for proper recycling. This shortage could greatly hinder the shift away from fossil fuels. And if you look on this map here, these are all of the identified rare earth element deposits within Canada. Some of them are already active, and some of them are either suspended or on hold. So as of 2020, there were 120 megatons of economically recoverable rare earth oxides in ore bodies globally, with China topping the list of national reserves with 44 megatons. So despite the criticality of these elements in the global transition to renewable energy production, many countries are quite hesitant to encourage rare earth element mining due to the high social and ecological cost of the process. Rare earth elements are geologically associated with the radioactive elements uranium and thorium. So this means that depending on the host rock, now it doesn't mean every single rare earth element deposit, but depending on the host rock, the extraction, processing, the extraction and processing of rare earth elements can lead to radioactive contamination for communities and for workers. The impacts of rare earth element contamination on human and animal health are also very poorly studied because this is still a somewhat new mining industry and it's expanding quite rapidly. The World Health Organization has still yet to publish safe thresholds for rare earth elements in soil and groundwater, and this means that proper monitoring and mitigation of contamination is still very difficult because we actually don't have a safe baseline. The process of extracting rare earth elements is also very challenging, even by mining standards. It uses more energy and water than many other metals. It's also very expensive, and this is due to the individual extraction of rare earth elements during processing, the low concentration of rare earth oxides in most deposits, and then the additional requirements associated with radioactive contamination. The processing of rare earth elements requires the use of hazardous chemicals. This can add to waste management difficulties already there through the radioactive contamination. And then finally, depending on the method of mining, deforestation and then damage to topsoil and vegetation can be very significant at the mine site. Historically, society has seen communities and lands sacrificed to extractive activities as a necessary trade-off due to the criticality of many of these resources for broader economic and social gains. Sacrificing one community for the comfort of another is unsustainable, and it's critical that we recognize this now so that we don't make the same mistakes during the energy transition that originally led us to climate change. So the focus of my research has been to take rare earth element mining, a process that is a history of being just unsustainably damaging, and determine how it could contribute to sustainability on multiple scales, which seems impossible, but luckily there have been people before me who've done a bit of work on this. So while the process of extracting and using a non-renewable resource, such as rare earth elements, cannot itself be sustainable, work has been done to determine how to use mining as a process that contributes to overall well-being. In 2004, Anthony Hodge discussed this idea in his paper, Mining 7 Questions to Sustainability, from Mitigating Impact to Encouraging Contribution. So in this paper, he discusses the idea of using mines as a bridge to the future. And this means that while you recognize that the activity of each mine has a clear beginning and an end, the implications of that activity, meaning both the impact of the mine itself and then the products that are being extracted, can go on indefinitely with proper recycling. In this sense, rare earth element mining can make positive contributions to sustainability by both supplying the resources critical for eliminating society's dependence on greenhouse gas generating hydrocarbons, such as oil and gas, and by using the opportunities and the revenues from individual mines to ensure positive legacies and contribute to lasting well-being through careful planning and assessment. To aid in this, I have first designed a set of generic criteria for sustainability assessment, and then I've specified it to help guide rare earth element mining within Canada. So these two lists show the set of generic criteria for sustainability assessment that I've developed based on a very extensive literature review. As you can see, these are condensed lists. I do have very, very long ones with very long descriptions, and if anybody actually wants to read more about this, please let me know. I'd be happy to send you a copy. I have chosen to split my generic criteria up into 2 lists. As you can see, I have my substantive criteria and my process features. So in all of the papers that I reviewed, authors generally chose to either combine substantive and process features into one set of criteria, or they focused on one or the other. I personally felt that neither of these options were the best. And I've chosen to create 2 sets of criteria that guide kind of different parts of the assessment process, and they complement each other so that it creates a fully comprehensive package. So the substantive criteria here are primarily inspired by the generic criteria for sustainability assessment by Gibson et al. And the process features are adapted from the Next Generation Assessment Framework by Sinclair et al., as well as the book, The Next Generation of Impact Assessment, a critical review of the Canadian Impact Assessment Act by Dwell and Sinclair in 2021. I've incorporated recent research on planetary capacities, such as the carbon cycle, into criterion 5 of these substantive features. I have also reworded criterion 6, which I think now better reflects the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I've also incorporated the idea of cumulative effects into the description of criterion 7. I think anybody who has done any research on sustainability assessment would agree that cumulative effects are a critical part of this assessment process. The process features are a compact version of the Next Generation Assessment Framework that focuses specifically on process features that I saw repeated among the other frameworks that I reviewed. I've included separate criteria for both comparing alternatives and for managing trade-offs, and this is to reflect the importance of this process in guiding rare earth element mining, considering that allowing rare earth element mining in itself is generally recognized as including some unavoidable trade-offs, even if there end up being net positive contributions to sustainability. So the next step in my framework was to specify my framework for rare earth element mining in Canada. Like my generic framework, this one is divided into substantive and process features. This slide shows you the first set, which is the substantive. This framework is designed to provide project-level guidance and planning for the assessment of rare earth element mines in Canada. To build this framework, I performed a literature review of rare earth element mining internationally, including the opportunities, impacts, and legacies. Considering that Canada does not have a history of rare earth element mining, I basically took my generic framework and I used that to guide my literature review of the Canadian mining industry. And I focused specifically on identifying the primary characteristics of the Canadian context, which would be likely to affect rare earth element mining and its impacts. I then performed another literature review of various frameworks by international mining associations, because I felt like that gave me the industry perspective that the academic research was lacking. And then through an iterative approach, I compared the results of both of these literature reviews with my generic framework. I found all the elements that aligned, and I've created this framework you see here. So this slide, very similar to my substantive, but this is the process features. So these mirror the process features presented in the generic criteria with an emphasis on mining-specific considerations such as life cycle assessments, which you see under criterion 6. These will be critical for rare earth element mining, considering its anticipated uses in renewable energy. Recognition of Indigenous rights and authority is also of particular importance in this context, given that many rare earth element rare earth element deposits in Canada are on Indigenous land. And again, if you were to see my full tables with descriptions, you would see a lot of attention to the idea of co-governance as opposed to consultation. And these would be through multiple different things, co-governance as in joint assessments or as in Indigenous-led assessments, which are now starting to be recognized in BC. The final step in my research will be to apply this framework to the Nechalacho project in the Northwest Territories. So this is very exciting for me. It's the first operational rare earth element mine in Canada. It's only the second in North America. It's located on Thor Lake, about 100 kilometers southeast of Yellowknife in the Mackenzie Mining District, on the traditional lands of the local Métis and Dene First Nations. So it began its first stage of operation in June of 2021, and it aims to produce the lowest cost return on investment outside of China due to an outrageously high-grade deposit. The Northwest Territories assessment process has a co-governance foundation in modern land claim agreements with the Indigenous authorities in the Mackenzie Valley. The environmental assessment was done by the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board, half of which is nominated by Indigenous land claim organizations. The other half is nominated by federal and territorial governments. The Mackenzie Valley process places an emphasis on sustainability. The review board is required to incorporate all socioeconomic and cultural impacts into their review, as well as the biophysical. It's also required to assess all cumulative effects of every project that they review. And it is under their Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. It requires their review board to consider all traditional knowledge that's shared with them during the assessment process. During the assessment of this project, I think there were 3 reports that were shared with them that had to be taken into consideration. So while I have not yet applied my framework to the Nechalacho project in a methodical way, that's the last part of my thesis, I have begun a basic application, and I found many elements of the project that do align with my framework. The mining company has signed a participation agreement and an accommodation agreement to provide training, employment opportunities, and business opportunities for local Indigenous peoples. And over 70% of the workforce that began extraction was Indigenous, including management and supervisor roles. They also hired a construction company owned by the local Dene First Nation to manage all operations at the mine site. This is extremely exciting because this is actually the first time in Canadian history that an Indigenous-owned company is managing all extraction on their own lands. It's pretty crazy that it took us until 2021 for that to happen, but it's finally happening. So this step has taken the local community, and it has moved them from passive observers to more active participants in the overall process. The first day of extraction at this site began with a traditional Dene ceremony, and this included prayers for the safety of the workers and for the protection of the land and the waters. This project is also protecting the local ecosystem as well as the climate system by using innovative technology, which is particle ore sorting. So this is a type of sorting that's previously been used in diamond mining, has never been used for metals before, but basically it means they're using X-rays rather than chemicals to sort their ore at the site. Now, this is extremely exciting because it means no chemicals and no tailings ponds at the site. And for anybody who is familiar with mining, that's enormous. So initial processing is also going to be taking place in Saskatoon. So this is going to provide additional jobs for Canadians. It also eliminates international shipping of heavy ore, which is a very carbon-intensive process. Now, a more comprehensive application of my framework to this case will help to assess the project and to test my framework for future case applications. This slide here shows you both sets of the criteria for specified for rare earth element mining that I've shown you earlier. So just at a first glance, if we're looking at the substantive criteria, we can see that the project is going to expand transitional opportunities to enhance livelihoods, lives, and communities through the career and educational opportunities both locally and then as well on a national scale through the processing in Saskatchewan. It is at the very least protecting the relationships among the social, the economic, and the environmental systems through the measures taken to protect the environment, such as through processing and through ore sorting, the economic viability of the materials and the jobs created, as well as the community involvement in the overall process. The new technology for sorting is an innovative way to increase efficiency and reduce pressures on natural resources and community capacities while protecting the local ecosystem. At the moment, it appears it is doing the bare minimum to contribute to climate responsibility, but a more in-depth analysis of the project could still change that conclusion, we'll see. It's enhancing equity through inclusion and distribution of opportunities. It's also contributing to positive legacies through the opportunities discussed under Criterion 1, and through the actual use of the ore, which is going to be shipped to Germany to be used in electric vehicles. The process features are more difficult to assess at this point in my research, but there is clearly a large emphasis on Indigenous rights and authority in this project. So as you can see through this basic application, many of the components that I touched on are actually serving for multiple different criteria. And that's the way that a sustainability assessment should work. There should be mutually reinforcing gains under every single criterion here in order for the project to basically pass the test and prove that it is contributing to sustainability and overall well-being. So in conclusion, with today's technology, we cannot achieve a transition to renewable energy production without the use of rare earth elements. Canada is in a unique position to serve as an example of how to supply these critical elements in a way that contributes to overall well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eve, for getting us started. Next up, I'd like to call up Guillermo Lombardi-Garbellini from the University of Saskatchewan, joining us from Saskatoon, who will be giving a presentation on environmental assessment as a tool for managing impacts on wetlands. Please welcome Guillermo.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Guillermo Garbellini, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan under Dr. Bran Noble and Dr. Sherry Westbrook. Even though I'm coming from Saskatchewan and doing my research in British Columbia and Yukon, I think there's a very important topic to the EA process in Ontario also. Just to give you some insight into my study, I'm looking into how the EA practice is managing the impacts of mining operations on wetlands in British Columbia and Yukon, as I said, with also a focus on how the mitigation hierarchy is being applied, which is a common strategy to manage wetland impacts and to achieve a no net loss of wetlands. So today I'll be presenting some of my results on that. Just to give you a start in introduction to my research, wetlands are among the most productive and valuable ecosystems in the world, and Canada has a big portion of it. They are very important because they perform a range of physical, chemical, and biological processes, which are known as functions. And these functions, they are valuable to society, which in turn are called ecosystem services. Some of the examples of ecosystem services are named as flood and sediment control, nutrient removal, carbon storage, as well as recreational and spiritual significance. So it is crucial to protect wetlands due to their ecological, social, and economic importance. However, we haven't treated wetlands very well, being heavily impacted because of the increasing pressure of developments, and part of wetland losses has been driven by the mining industry. So in one hand, we have Canada with one of the largest mining industries in the world, being extremely important to the Canadian economy. In the other, we have an activity that can permanently impact wetlands and change important functions and consequently the ecosystem services that benefit us. So this increasing wetland loss has made wetland conservation an issue here in Canada. And as a result, federal and provincial wetland policies came into place. Some of these policies have the goal of no net loss, which is best achieved using the mitigation hierarchy. The first step would be avoiding impacts where avoidance is not entirely possible. You would then seek for minimization measures, followed by on-site restoration. And the last step would be compensating for any residual impacts. These policies support existing legislation, such as environmental assessment acts, and in the EA process, mitigation hierarchy is also a common strategy to manage impacts on wetlands. So to understand the current EA practice of wetland impact and mitigation in British Columbia and Yukon, I analyzed 36 environmental impact statements in the last 12 years. Just being more precise, 16 EISs in British Columbia and 20 evaluation reports in Yukon, which I will explain in a moment. The next steps will be interviewing key participants to get more insights on the issues presented here also. And why am I doing that in BC and Yukon? The mining industry plays an important role in both economies, and the mining activities often overlaps with wetland areas, especially when we are talking about placer mining in Yukon. Also, the EA process in BC and Yukon are quite different. BC, only major projects trigger an EA and is proponent-led environmental impact statements, while in Yukon, most projects undergo an EA and the assessment evaluation is completed by the regional officers. So it is a report done by the regulatory agency. So these differences in the EA processes reflected on my final list of projects to review, as well as the results I got so far. So for the document analysis, data collection was done through public EA registries, and my goal was to have a final list of 20 projects for BC and 20 projects for Yukon. Due to the large number of EAs available, I first limited my selection to only completed mining EAs within the last 12 years, and then I checked those that identified wetland impacts. For Yukon, because of the larger number of EAs available, I also limited to only placer mining projects. So BC was easy. Applying the first filter of completed mining EAs in the last 12 years, I got 20 projects. And then when checking the ones that had wetland impacts characterized, I ended up with 16 for my final list. In Yukon, same thing. Completed placer mining projects in the last 12 years were a total of 462 projects. And I went through 332 to get to my final list of 20. This means that only 20 out of 332 projects have wetland impacts description. And I think this is a very interesting piece of information to highlight due to the low number of EAs characterizing impacts on wetland, considering that placer mining activities often overlaps wetland areas. So the first result I have here is on wetland impacts predicted for the full sample of EAs reviewed. From the 16 EAs reviewed in BC, I found a total of 111 wetland impacts predicted. And Yukon, from the 20 EAs, I found a total of 94 wetland impacts predicted. So I came up with a set of questions to see how these wetland impacts were described in terms of area, wetland class, functions, and ecosystem services. And then I simply answered these questions as yes or no. Yes being basically they did provide the information I was looking for, and no, they did not provide information. For the first question, are impacts characterized? More than 90% of their impacts were clearly stated, both in BC and Yukon. However, when answering the following questions, if wetland class impacted was identified and area impacted was quantified, the lack of providing this information increased roughly to 40%. While in Yukon, this information was not provided at all. When defining functions impacted, the absence of this information was even higher, representing almost half of the total number in BC. And again, Yukon did not provide this information. And it's also possible to notice that when it comes to defining the ecosystem services impacted, none of the jurisdictions did. For BC, it doesn't mean that they are lacking on that, but maybe because it was not the purpose to define ecosystem services, since they were defining the functions impacted. And in Yukon, it is uncertain if they wanted to define it or not. Then I did a similar approach for the total number of wetland mitigation measures that I found. And in BC, I got a total of 246 mitigation measures proposed, and Yukon a total of 28. And the results I got are a bit disappointing. First, I wanted to see if those mitigation actions proposed were linked to their impacts. In BC, from the 246 mitigation measures proposed, almost 70% were not linked to their impacts. And in Yukon, this percentage is even higher with 96%. In the next question, I wanted to know if wetland functions to be mitigated were defined, and the absence of this information is even higher, missing 80% of the total in BC, and in Yukon, this information is not provided. For the last question, I wanted to see if mitigation statements were being specific. And when, for this question, specific means citing any regulatory documents, distance, timing, responsibility, or management plans. Otherwise, the mitigation statements, they are vague or imprecise that serve little purpose in guiding the effective management of a project's impacts. And again, I didn't have positive outcomes on that, with 37% of mitigations measures being specific in BC and only 7% in Yukon being specific. Lastly, I quantified the use of each component of the mitigation hierarchy, as well as the compensation approaches proposed just in BC, because Yukon, they didn't propose any compensation measures. From the total of 246 mitigations measures proposed in BC, the most common was minimization with 74%, followed by avoidance measures with 15%, and a few compensation and restoration ones. Looking closer at the compensation measures proposed in BC, I found three different approaches, and you can see that 7 were proposed as wetland enhancement actions, and 6 are wetland creation actions, and then two off-site reclamation actions. One of them were not specific which type of compensation was proposed. In Yukon, on the other hand, from the total of 28 mitigation measures, most of them were restoration with 39%, followed by minimization, and lastly, avoidance measures. So to wrap up the presentation, what is the state of practice in BC and Yukon? Well, in Yukon it's inconclusive if there is wetland loss because they don't quantify the impacted area and lack on other information I was looking for. In BC, the results showed several inconsistencies, especially regarding to mitigation measures. Also in BC, as you can see in the graph there, from the total 16 EAs I reviewed, 4 of them considered the entire mitigation hierarchy, that is avoidance, minimization, restoration, and compensation, and still would have a net wetland loss. 9 EAs did not exploit the entire mitigation sequence, only applying the 2 top ones, and also would have a net wetland loss. And lastly, only 3 EAs considered all or part of the mitigation hierarchy, and the outcome was a no net loss of wetlands. So more than 80% of the 16 EAs I reviewed in BC could result in a net wetland loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Guillermo. So for the third presentation, I'd like to call up Sarah Merriam and Melissa Raful from Parsons and the West Corridor Constructors, who will be giving us a presentation on erosion and sediment control lessons learned on a large-scale transportation project, the Highway 401 expansion. So please welcome Sarah and Melissa.
All right, thank you. So our presentation, it's really gonna dive into, I think, a major factor area with our infrastructure projects. Erosion and sediment control is one of the key environmental issues on projects that really needs detailed review and consideration during detailed design and construction stages. And so especially when we think about our sensitive natural environments, our wetlands, fisheries, watercourses, and our waterways in general. So with West Corridor Constructors, I am the Environmental Compliance Officer. Sarah is the Environmental Manager. So we've been involved with that project since the start and happy to get a chance to talk about our experiences. So to give you a bit of a project overview, the Ministry of Transportation, MTO, and Infrastructure Ontario selected West Corridor Constructors, so I'm going to call that WCC as we move forward, to design, build, and finance the Highway 401 expansion project under a public-private partnership model. WCC is an integrated joint venture comprised of AECON Infrastructure Management, Parsons, and Amoco Design Build. So I'll give you some timeline info for some context. The preliminary design and environmental assessments, there were 2 of them that were completed under the MTO Class EA for provincial transportation facilities. These were completed in 2013. WCC was selected in spring 2019 as the project consortium, and our detailed design commenced in April 2019. Construction start was October 2019, and our expected substantial completion date is late 2022. So to the actual project, the 401 expansion, it's approximately 18 kilometers long and includes widening the existing 6-lane highway to either 10 or 12 lanes. The limits span from Regional Road 25 in the town of Milton on the west end to the Credit River in Mississauga at the east project limit. So I guess if any of you have traveled on the 401 through the GTA in the past few years, you probably have seen the work going on. And so just wanted to point out here too, those 2 MTO Class A's that were completed in 2013, they kind of each represented one half of the corridor. They got combined together into one big project under the P3 model. So some key elements and different things being designed and constructed on this project were reconfiguration of 6 interchanges, high occupancy vehicle lanes. We had bridge replacements and rehabilitations, including some bridges over waterways such as the Credit River. We had structural, non-structural culvert replacements, extensions, and rehabs. There were some stormwater management ponds constructed. We had 2 major watercourse realignments at Hornby Creek and Mullet Creek. There was fencing, both MTO, standard right-of-way fencing, and also wildlife fencing, landscaping and restoration, and then some other supporting facilities such as drainage, lighting, signage, and carpool walks. So with all this construction work that was going to happen, we had a number of different considerations when determining our approach and implementation of ESC. So the 2 MTO Class EAs previously completed did include some concerns and commitments about ESC. I think most of us here are kind of familiar with, at that preliminary design stage, that the EA commitments and details about ESC are fairly high level. So for example, these EAs, kind of a couple points that they touched on were apply standard erosion and sediment control measures, example, silt fence, consistent with MTO best management practices and Ontario provincial standards and specifications. Control measures shall be implemented prior to work, monitored and maintained during construction, and until all disturbed areas have been effectively stabilized. The EAs had some specifics about locations that did need enhanced ESC measures, but very little direction on how to actually implement on the ground. So that was the detail that us as WCC really had to flesh out during our detailed design and construction stages in accordance with our contractual requirements and then applicable ESC guidelines such as the MTO ESC guide. So we also had more than 25 drainage and watercourse crossings through the corridor, some with sensitive fisheries and also multiple in-water work timing windows. So we had to obtain various permits and approvals that had linkage to ESC requirements. So it includes a DFO Fisheries Act authorization, Endangered Species Act approvals from the MECP, and permits to take water. And then I guess in terms of the EA commitments, the ESC commitments in these permits, some permits were quite general. So they just say, have a robust erosion and sediment control plan. Follow standard BMPs. Other permits were a bit more specific. Some would say, the specific type of ESC measure that was required for a specific location. And then we had to make sure we followed that. So the other thing that was really key for us to consider with this big, large-scale project, this big linear corridor, was a concurrent design and construction process. So we knew we'd be at a point where we would have clearance for some construction works to start, while other things and other aspects of the projects were still getting sorted out. So the detailed design may have still be getting developed for other locations, but some pieces could begin. So we needed to have an ESC plan in place so earlier construction could move forward, while design and other details were getting sorted out. And then given such a long linear corridor, we also had to keep in mind that construction could be at very different stages depending on where you were in the corridor. 18 kilometers is quite long, and something going on at one end could be at a very different stage than something going on at the other end. So then what did we do? So I'll take you through a bit of our ESC design process. We first developed what we called a corridor-wide overall erosion and sediment control plan prior to early works construction. And it served 2 purposes for us. It gave us general guidance, strategy, and approach to ESC measures based on the overarching principles on the slide. And then it also guided the approach for further ESC plans and drawings to come. So it wasn't necessarily saying what had to happen everywhere, but what we had to do next. What this plan did do was it did give enough information and some simple ESC drawings with regards to our low risk early works. And early works for us meant work outside of sensitive areas, away from water courses. And so that was so that that construction could move forward. So at this time, we also completed an erosion and sediment control risk assessment to also help guide our ESC measures and approaches based on the likelihood of erosion and sedimentation. So the map, you can see that represents about 1 kilometer of our corridor, and the table corresponds to locations on the map. And there's a mix. So you can see just on that 1 kilometer, we've got some low risk areas, the green, some moderate risk areas, the yellow, and high risk areas, the red. Critical areas of concern in this risk assessment would be fisheries watercourses and species at risk locations, which would automatically become high risk. And then the drainage team also considered slopes, erosion potentials that fed into that table you can see there, and their risk and ratings. So this was done for the whole 18 kilometers of the corridor so that we knew where the risks were and we knew what needed to be done for the more detailed ESC plans for the future stages of construction. And so, there we go. So that was the next part of the process, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but more detailed plans were then produced, and they were called construction period site-specific erosion and sediment control plans and drainage and sediment management plans. And I'm just going to refer to them as ESCPs as we go forward. So what we did here was the drainage team divided our whole 18-kilometer corridor into 15 zones. So that was based on drainage area, watercourse system, and other key features and works occurring in each zone. And each of these zones had a site-specific ESCP. And it was really these 15 plans that dove into the details of what was required at each location for each stage of construction. And there were very detailed drawings showing all those measures. So these ESCPs were also updated as the project progressed through the various stages of construction. So I know it's a little bit hard to see, don't worry, I'll talk you through some things, but this is an example of those ESC detailed drawings. And again, this covers what you can see here, about just 1 kilometer of the corridor. And the yellow, so you can kind of see that, it shows the construction work zone. And the green outlines, if you can make that out, it represents the drainage area that will be disturbed due to the construction. And then all the other kind of colors and symbols represent different ESC measures or related project features. So silt fence, sediment traps, and access roads, for example. A lot of information on here. It really brought everything together to guide the works on the ground. It involves calculations and things from the drainage team. So a lot went into them. And this is really what was used by the construction team on the site. And so pulling these together was one thing. I guess how this got implemented on the site sometimes didn't exactly happen exactly like these drawings showed. And that's what Sarah's going to get a little bit more into.
Is it just this one? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Melissa. So Melissa really brought us through the design of the erosion sediment control plans, and I'm going to talk more so about how it went during construction and the adaptive management that was used and some of the lessons learned. So putting together the design and plans was one thing, but the implementation of it was obviously an entirely different issue. And this led to quite a bit of adaptive management on site and lessons learned from the project. Installation of the erosion and sediment control measures took place in advance of the clearing and grubbing operations. Some of these early ESC measures and silt fence also functioned to delineate the project limits and any environmental no-go zones that we had. The early silt fence locations were also to protect fisheries watercourses that we did not have permission to do any works with them. And as the areas were stripped, more ESC measures could be implemented, such as rock check dams and sediment bases in the ditches. As works progress, the specific ESC measures continue to be installed in a phased approach. This was dependent on construction schedule and for water courses when work could be allowed below the high water mark or when the in-water work timing window opened up. Sensitive locations were purposely not grubbed until they actually had to be. A key part of this implementation was the need for field fits, or updates to the ESC design. Actually being on the ground sometimes necessitated changes and adaptations of what the design drawings might have shown. In a lot of cases, we had field fits and changes that were enhancing, and we were adding more ESC measures in the ground or on the ground compared to what was shown in the ESC plans. But there were sometimes substitutions and substantial changes from what was in the drawings. And the rationale and significance of the changes had to be considered by regulatory agencies if this was covered under the permit requirements. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Now we'll get into discussing bridging the gaps between the ESC design process and implementation. On paper, it's simple. Install ESC measures and remove vegetation. However, silt fence installation in areas of thick vegetation and long grasses is very hard or impossible to install with machinery, and removal of vegetation was sometimes required in advance. The same was also true for ESC measures being installed in ditch lines. This operation had to be carefully overseen to ensure that sediment wasn't being transported to the watercourses while this phased approach occurred. We also installed silt fence to show the limits of the work area. However, once the ditch lines were cut, the silt fence actually didn't need to be used anymore because the drainage had changed. And the silt fence didn't actually function as an ESC measure. But because they were included in the ESC plans for that specific construction stage, they had to be maintained. We also had field fits which were needed because the ESC measures weren't actually working in the field. Any field fits, again, had to be included in the next ESCP plan update for the zone. Keep going the wrong way. Another lesson learned was in hindsight, we should have specified timelines for maintenance of ESC measures since it was subjective, especially for medium and low risk areas, and sometimes timelines when the environmental monitors thought ESC maintenance was needed and when construction team thought that they were needed was different. Filter socks were very widely used on this project and substituted for silt fence as well as straw bales. And one that the design team really learned the benefits of from the construction team. Insulation causes less disturbance. They can be reused and moved around. And when construction is complete, it can be cut open and wood chips can be degraded on site. One operation that we really struggled with during construction was pumping operations. When water needs to be moved on a construction project that's under tight timelines, we need to reiterate to staff that hoses need to be attached to filter bags. Filter bags need to be 30 meters away from the water course, ideally placed on vegetation. And we had to set up a treatment train approach for this water to be discharged. This can sometimes feel very frustrating for a construction team that just want to get the water out of the area so they can continue on with the works and keep construction on schedule. We also had a very tight corridor, and setbacks sometimes were very hard to achieve, especially the 30-meter requirement. That's a lot of area, especially when you're working next to a highway. So sometimes we had to be very creative and flexible of what could be done on site. A recommendation is to have the construction team involved during design to help develop the ESC plans. We had construction with us during the course of the design on the project, which was really quite helpful. Managing and adapting is key on a project as large as this one with a very tight construction schedule, and site conditions are constantly changing. ESC measures need to be adapted on site and changed as per the stage of construction. While a sediment spill is always unfortunate, they also really show where you have gaps in your ESC measures. We had a number of spills related to stormwater management ponds outside of the lands that discharged the MTO right-of-way that was unknown during detailed design. We had some areas that had routine issues with erosion sedimentation causing spills that, again, were unknown until construction began. ESC is ever evolving and adapting on site, and there needs to be regular site visits from designers and the environmental team to understand field conditions. What ESC measures are obsolete, what locations need more ESC measures in order to develop a workable ESC program, and then field fits also need to be relayed from the field to the design team. And in some cases, the designs then need to be updated to reflect what's in the field. There were also lessons learned regarding prescribed ESC measures and permit conditions and what actually worked in the field. A typical requirement for working around red side dace or sensitive water courses and was included in our 17-2C Endangered Species Act permit for red side dace was double row of heavy duty non-woven erosion sediment control fencing with straw bales staked in between to prevent the migration of sediment and deleterious substances into tributaries. However, we quickly realized that straw bales of the required dimensions were difficult to secure and aren't typically made very often anymore. And this was especially true during COVID. The construction team instead suggested that we use the filter socks, which were used on another construction project they had recently been involved with that had red side dace as well. So WCC obtained approval from MTO and MECP for this substitution. One suggestion is to discuss substitution for straw bale requirements in permits and approvals. Red side dace regulated habitat is 30 meters on either side of a water course, which is a really large area that technically you can't work in until you obtain your permits and approvals and the in-water work timing window opens up. WCC obtained approval for working in this area from MECP in advance of both those items, including some clearing, however, no grubbing, ESC installation, retaining wall work, and ramp construction. We also obtained a permit to take water for works in the corridor. The water being discharged to the environment had a very high standard in order to be released. Water had to meet the provincial water quality objectives and also the Canadian water quality guidelines for the protection of aquatic life. WCC found this very hard to achieve since we were being asked to treat the water to a higher standard than what was the water courses were within the corridor. Again, this was something that should have been discussed with the regulatory agencies during the permit negotiation stage. Things that were successful for the project included daily environmental inspections conducted year-round. We had consistent environmental monitors who developed relationships with the construction team. We fostered a collaborative relationship between the environmental and construction teams, which can sometimes be quite combative on construction projects. We were of the mindset that we weren't there to police construction. We are there to make sure that they help to deliver the project on time and on budget. This really helped everybody work together and helped with the quick identification of issues in the field and them being closed out in a timely fashion. Also using the construction team's knowledge helped to get everybody involved in the process of ESC issues on site. So this slide shows the site inspection form that we used for the project. This could be completed on phones or iPads, and this was really easy way to fill out inspections in the field, and then a digital record is kept of them. Deficiencies were logged and assigned to specific people to address, and the environmental inspectors were the only ones who could close them out once corrective issues were inspected in the fields. We also developed pretty intensive environmental training, and this was updated yearly, and every year people had to undertake this environmental training so that they could go on site. The environmental team also developed a number of standard operating procedures and best management practices for items that needed more guidance for people in the field, and then the people in the field were trained on these items. We found that bringing the client and regulatory agencies on site was a great way to get people involved, and sometimes we would have a brainstorming session regarding specific issues that we were dealing with. So the key takeaways include site visits and communications is key for the success of projects. Also engaging construction during the design phase is to develop your ESC plan to create a workable plan in the field. You can never start your ESC design process too early. since you'll need them in place for every and all construction activities. When developing your plan, make sure to review the surrounding land use, determine which areas might be of higher risk, and not just focus on the study area. You also won't know all the issues until you start construction and start to remove the vegetation on site. When developing your ESC plans, make sure you understand the availability of ESC measures in the marketplace, as well as new innovative products that can be used. If you have multiple ESC plans for a project, please develop a good tracking system to make sure that you know when updates are required. And in the field, create a good tracking system for ESC deficiencies. When possible, bring desired ESC approaches into your permit and approval negotiations. So what's next? Construction is still ongoing for the 4.1 expansion projects. We're at the stage now where works are all completed in some areas, so we're just under the process of removal of ESC measures. If you want any further updates about the project website is included above on the slide, and that concludes our discussion about erosion sediment control measures on a large-scale infrastructure project. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you very much, Sarah and Melissa. So we're down to the last presentation. It's me. I think I'm pretty much the only thing standing between you and lunch, except for hopefully a few questions for our panel. So please bear with me. My name's Andrew Harkness. I work with Morrison Hershfield, and I'm pleased to be with you today to present on climate vulnerability and risk assessment, current practice, and implications for environmental assessment. And in the time that we have, we'll probably just scratch the surface a little bit, but hopefully it'll foster some more conversations in the time that we have here today. And this has been a shift for me over the last few years. It's something that I used to think about occasionally, but now I think about this every day. So I'm excited to be working on climate change every day. So increasingly at Morrison Hershfield, we were striving to include a climate change focus across the range of projects and services that we deliver for both our public and private sector clients. This includes helping our clients both account for and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also account for and adapt to climate change. As lead of Morrison Hershfield's Climate Change Committee of Practice, my mandate includes engaging our entire firm in taking action on climate change. My presentation today will highlight lessons learned and implications for environmental assessment from integrating climate change considerations into project planning and design. I will highlight just 2 recent Ontario projects we have undertaken, but in fact our team has worked on at least, I'd say 15 to 20 climate change risk assessment projects across Canada this year on a range of new and existing infrastructure, as well as projects at a community level and including natural assets. So weather versus climate. What we say is that climate is what we expect and weather is what we get. Weather is much more variable. Climate tends to be more stable, but is still subject to change. Weather can change in the scale of minutes to hours, whereas typically climate changes on much larger timescales, such as over decades and centuries. Currently, of course, we are on a pathway towards significant and potentially catastrophic climate change. We hear almost daily now of the global call for action to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius on average compared to pre-industrial levels. Many of our clients are moving quickly to respond to the urgent global call for action on climate change and expect engineers, planners, and other specialists to be part of the solution. Various professional associations are also calling on us to take action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change risk. We have a professional duty to act. The 2017 Ontario provincial guidance document, considering climate change in the environmental assessment process, directs project proponents to consider both the effects of a project on climate change, as well as the effects of climate change on the project. In other words, both climate change and mitigation and climate change adaptation should be considered. We know that the climate is already changing compared to historic levels. Communities are experiencing negative climate hazard impacts under current climate conditions, including, depending on where you live, increased severe heat, flooding, and wildfires, just to name a few. Further climate change is unfortunately inevitable now, meaning such events will become more common and severe. Planning for climate change can make our communities' infrastructure and spaces more resilient, reducing economic, social, and environmental impacts. Assessing climate change risk should consider exposure, likelihood, and vulnerability. There are a range of frameworks available, and we heard some really excellent work already in the conference about how this work is being done that are used to conduct climate risk assessment, and these are typically based on well-established ISO standards. The PIEVC protocol was developed by Engineers Canada with support from Natural Resources Canada to assist engineers and planners in factoring climate change impacts into plans for design, operation, and maintenance of public infrastructure. The PIEVC high-level screening guide was released earlier this year and is the framework that we at Morstan Hirschfield have been using quite extensively ever since. So just a little bit more about the process. Typically starts with defining the project and determining the scope. Scoping the study includes, but is not limited to, developing the objectives of the plan, identifying the physical, social, environmental, and temporal boundaries, defining the elements that will be included and excluded, confirming the context of the assessment, determining minimum levels of service, and if the assessment includes any critical services that must remain operable in an emergency. Who are the knowledge holders that can help inform the climate history and are aware of potential vulnerabilities for the project? Senior leadership, community elders, maintenance and operational staff, and community members, among others, should be consulted and included in the process. Next step is gathering data, developing a climate profile, which may vary depending on if it's an existing piece of infrastructure, new infrastructure, a community, what have you. But in terms of developing a climate profile, this typically includes gathering data on past, current, and future projected climatic conditions based on the timelines developed in the scoping exercise. And generally, we want to examine a broad range of potential climate hazards. We look at climate parameters, such as increased extreme heat days, precipitation changes, and try and translate these into potential climate hazards that may affect our project or program or whatever it is we're assessing, such as potentially drought or extreme precipitation. Then we get into the process of assessing risk and opportunities, looking at the potential interactions between the asset, the infrastructure, the community, and the climate hazards. As part of this, it's important to take a look at tolerances and thresholds. So are there tipping points that may need to be considered as part of the work? When is an impact going to become something that's very severe versus something that may be relatively minor? We need to take a look at the likelihood of specific climate hazards under existing and future conditions and assess the severity of a consequence if it occurs of a climate event exceeding a defined threshold. We often do these steps in a workshop format, which gets a lot of good thinking, in one place at one time, and there's a lot of sort of, good learning, in fact, that comes out of, a team working together. The outcome of this process is often the generation of a risk assessment matrix. As shown here, a numeric risk rating is determined for each impact based on the product of the exposure, likelihood, and consequence scores. Sometimes more detailed analysis is required at this stage to better understand the risks and the potential solutions. So then we get to the reporting and the actions. These can be detailed or high level, depending on the client needs. and should consider the client's level of risk tolerance and preferred approaches to managing risk, avoiding it altogether, transferring it to someone else, accepting it, or at least for a period of time, or reducing it. I would just like to shift focus a little bit and talk a little bit about another tool or framework that we've been starting to apply. The Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure's Erosion Sustainable Infrastructure Rating System, it's a real mouthful, is a comprehensive framework of criteria that encompass a full range of environmental, social, and economic impacts that should be assessed in order to determine how a project has incorporated sustainability in its design, construction, and operation. This system is somewhat similar to LEED for people that are familiar with, the rating of building systems, which I think has, made a real difference in terms of building design, planning and design. And there are credits that can be assigned and certain levels of achievement that can be pursued in terms of assessing a project. Just two examples. One is related to the natural world. The credits allow the project teams to assess the effect of the project on the preservation and renewal of ecosystem functions. And for me, one that I've been really focusing on is the climate and risk elements and credits, which look at both minimizing emissions that may contribute to increased short and long-term climate change, and ensuring that infrastructure projects are resilient to short-term hazards or altered long-term future conditions. As we know, sustainability is often considered from at least three different perspectives: environmental protection and resource conservation, social well-being and equity, and economic prosperity and continuity. For a project or program, even a city or nation to be sustainable, it's essential that these critical elements are considered and be in balance. And there's really an opportunity to go much further, I would say, beyond sort of maybe our sort of typical approach, a sort of business as usual approach, and looking for synergies and taking a more holistic approach. As we see in document, unprecedented changes, including climate change, income and opportunity inequality, and resource constraints, project proponents are seeking better, more sustainable solutions to infrastructure challenges over the long term. So just two project examples I'd like to touch base on. The first one, the City of Ottawa has for many years operated a successful bus rapid transit system on a combination of dedicated rights-of-way and bus-only lanes, integrated with an extensive on-road bus network operating in mixed traffic. For the past approximately 10 years, the city has been building electrified light rail transit, which in part is replacing sections of the existing BRT system. The Canada LRT project represents a future 11-kilometer extension of LRT service through the city's western Greenbelt area to the former City of Canada, now part of the City of Ottawa. This City of Ottawa EA was conducted under the Transit Project Assessment process. Morrison Hirschfield worked as a partner to Parsons on this project, and among other roles, led the climate change aspects of the project. The climate change study included both a high-level climate change vulnerability and risk assessment, as well as a climate change mitigation or carbon footprint assessment, the latter of which focused on embodied carbon associated with the project construction. Through the process, we prepared a simple risk assessment matrix showing the estimated risk levels, high, medium, or low, associated with the main infrastructure components and the climate change factors. For example, extreme rain was considered to pose relatively high levels of risk in relation to possible flooding of track or guideway and washout or overtopping of culverts or bridges. Potential higher levels of vulnerability and risk were also identified associated with interactions between extreme rain events and power supply substations, as well as for freezing rain and overhead contact and catenary systems. There were lots of lessons learned. This was the first application of the provincial climate change guidance to a City of Ottawa transportation EA study. We found that the workshops were very effective, engaging a broad spectrum of city departments who provided input on facility planning, design, operations, maintenance, and health factors, things that we didn't always have conversations about during previous environmental assessment studies. process also helped raise awareness as to the importance of considering climate change early in project planning. Quick look at another project, the Mushkegowuk Council's Highway 11 to James Bay All-Season Road Feasibility Study. And Cheryl spoke and remembered our colleague and friend Mike Briggs earlier this morning, and Mike was part of this team and is in this photo here. And I was really pleased to get to work with Mike on this project. And we both learned a lot through the process and the project and the people that we met, spending time in northern communities, and we both grew a lot through this project. So I was, in addition to just working together on other fronts, this was a special time and a memory that I have of working with Mike. Morrison Hirschfield's client was the Mushkegowuk Council, which is the senior representative for 7 or 8 First Nations in the Western James Bay region of Northern Ontario. Our objective was to conduct a feasibility study looking at improving connectivity and access amongst the Western James Bay communities of Attawapiskat, Kasheshawan, Fort Albany, the Moose Factory area, and south to the Trans-Canada Highway and the Ontario Provincial Highway System. The communities north of Moosonee are typically mainly served by fly-in, fly-out access, although they do have a winter road that is becoming less and less reliable as years go by. Our study area was approximately 150,000 square kilometers, focused on the Western James Bay region. Our corridor alternatives included routes of up to 750 kilometers in length, and the recommended route ended up being about 525 kilometers long. So it was a pretty unique and interesting project for us. Our climate change projections considered historic conditions for the area in 2 future planning horizons, 2050 and 2080, and considered both moderate and high levels of climate change associated with RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. A short list of climate change variables was identified for inclusion in the assessment, as shown on the slide. But it's important to note that the region has already seen annual mean temperature increases of 1.5 degrees Celsius over the past 35 years, with winter warming of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius already. So the north is already warming quickly, changes happening fast. And as I mentioned, this concern about the winter road was one of the key drivers of doing this study. Through our community meetings and engagement and discussions that we had, we heard a lot of stories about the firsthand experience of people, who are very close to the land, and the quite dramatic changes in conditions that they have seen or experiencing in terms of living, being on the land and the life on the land. So a lot of concerns about climate change came out through this study, even though it wasn't the main focus of the study. So we did do a climate vulnerability and risk assessment, but just in the interest of time, I'd just like to touch base on a little bit about sustainability, because we did do a sort of a high-level application. We didn't pursue a whole accreditation of the project through the Envision Sustainability Framework. And we noted that the All-Season Road project, if ever implemented, would provide some very significant sustainability enhancements. And really, these were the drivers for the study related to improved community access, connectedness, access to healthcare, education, employment, shopping, and reduced cost of living. But there are also many concerns and challenges related to this project if it were ever to be implemented. We had not conducted an environmental assessment study, but I'm happy that we carried forward some of these considerations related to sustainability and climate change through this project for next stages of the project. So just as I wind things down, I'd just like to acknowledge our clients at the City of Ottawa. This material was presented with their support for the Canada LRT study. Parsons, our partner on that project, and Mushkegowuk Council for also supporting us, speaking about the Mushkegowuk study as well. So just in closing, a couple of things to leave you with. Please ensure that climate change mitigation are both being considered through your projects and studies and work that you're doing. Talk to your clients, teams, and partners. Look for opportunities to enhance project sustainability and above and beyond business as usual. Continue, as I'm sure everyone does, explore and develop new tools, skills, and approaches. And definitely continue to learn, discuss, and collaborate. Even incremental steps can make a big difference. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and to present on the integration of climate change into environmental assessment, project planning, and design. So with that, so we have a few minutes for questions from the floor or from online. Please come to the microphone.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is for you. I was very interested in your climate risk assessment methodology and the risk assessment matrix and everything. I believe you have probably applied it to projects, but I was wondering if it has ever been applied for strategic or regional assessment or even influenced like policy guidance or anything.
Yes, I haven't personally applied it at that level, but I know that the climate risk assessment in a broad sense can and is being applied to all sorts of things. So I know it's, including the PIBC high-level screening guide is being expanded over time to be applicable to portfolios of projects, programs as well. So I think the process is a good one, and it may need to be adapted a little bit depending on the application, but the basic underlying principles come from ISO risk assessment standards. So it's a yes for sure, and and probably this will continue to evolve as more and more people are looking to consider climate change risk in what they're doing. Thank you.
My question's for Sarah and Melissa. I'm a big sediment nerd, so thank you for your presentation. And I was wondering if there were any considerations of seasonally varying sources and pathways of sediment in the plan, and if that was addressed in any of the adaptive you were doing for that.
And I'm just going to jump in here because I'm supposed to repeat the question for the audience at home. So I believe it was, were there any seasonal variations in the plans and how they're being applied and developed? And I'll turn that over to Sarah and Melissa. Thank you.
So the construction or the DSMPs, ESCPs, how they were organized was they were for construction phase and stage construction. So we had a high level understanding of when they'd actually be carried out. Now in terms of the DSMP updates saying, okay, now this is the winter time, so therefore we have to have X, Y, and Z on the ground. No. What that really came into was the field fits, right? So during the winter time, things get frozen. They're not going to function as well, especially during those free thaw events. So we knew then that we had to do additional ESC measures in the field. And then that would be anything that was done in the field should have been updated then in the next DSMP. So the process was, changes are made from the environmental monitors in the field and the construction team. Then the owners of the DSMPs were the drainage engineers. They were to go out on site, review any of the field fits, and incorporate them into the next iteration of the design. So yeah, that was the process that we did.
Great, thank you.
Very good, thank you. Cheryl.
Yeah, I'm bringing the questions from online to start with. So
thank you.
This question is for Sarah, it's from Annalise. Are there lessons learned from your project that suggest changes to how mitigation and impact management commitments are made at the EA stage? And I think this is a mic directly to those folks. So
yeah, I'll answer part of that, and then Melissa can jump in as well, because that's the real thing that we're finding, right? So, planning, preliminary design, detailed design, construction. Preliminary design is when we typically get into most of our environmental assessment commitments, but it's so high level at that stage. So what does that actually mean? Install ESC measures on site, right? We really get into that more so during detailed design, especially now that on MTO projects, there's a requirement to do overview risk assessments, which is much more involved than previously it was, which was, 90% design drawings, add in some silt fence, best guesses, there you go. Now we have more of a methodology for actually, adding in the ESC measures in the field. And then when you get your permits and approvals, right, there's other specifications for erosion sediment control measurements. However, those are all done during detailed design. So we really need to think about what are we going to bring into preliminary design for erosion sediment control measures, because we know, especially when we do large scale projects like this, where there's an incredible amount of ground disturbance, right? The first operation construction does, they go in, they strip everything, right? Get the grass, get the vegetation out of the way. We have to manage so much exposed earth. And for us, that was the biggest risk during construction to the environment, was sediment spills. And why are we thinking about that so late in the process, right?
Right.
So.
Thanks. I agree with most of what you're saying, and I think it's a little bit difficult to be able to bring in many specifics at the preliminary design and the typical EA stage, because so much is also linked to the drainage team. This is not just an environmental team looking at all these and trying to pull these together. It's drainage, fisheries, ESC experts, and then when you are on design build, you bring the construction team in. I think, so to the overview risk assessments, I do think that's starting to be brought into EAs now as a commitment. I think a big thing will be looking at the guidelines and the standards, because I think a lot of those still might, a lot of times like, well, this is what the guideline says, we've got to use the straw bales. Looking to maybe enhance those guidelines to have either flexibility for the future stages of the project and the ability to adapt processes would probably a good way to go, because that's what we kind of ran into with, well, this is what the OPSS says, so contractually you have to follow that. But if it's not working on site, you need to be able to adapt and do what's best for the environment.
Thank you. The next question is from Brittany. Brittany, I hope you're feeling okay. Alexandra is really worried about you too. We missed you yesterday. It's for Guillermo. Guillermo, do you have plans to or know of any other researchers working to do a similar type of wetlands assessment in Ontario? So I knew you would say that.
My focus is British Columbia and Yukon, but it's really applicable in Ontario because Ontario has a lot of wetlands here. And it would be a very interesting research also.
So I'll just pipe in where my WCS Canada hat. Ontario's wetland conservation strategy is still in a draft. It was produced in 2017. And it's actually, really poorly subscribed in terms of both ecosystem services, in particular in the far north, where we have the second largest peatland complex in the world and the largest wetland complex in North America. And I'll just also indicate, I just wanted to ask you too, Guillermo, how are cumulative effects considered in any of these projects? I mean, it's really a cumulative effects issue with this project by project assessment of wetland impacts. So that was my first question. And just a flag too, like the placer mining in the Yukon is actually an incredibly destructive process when it comes to wetlands. And so again, a cumulative effects approach is actually really useful. I'm wondering if any of these conversations that you had with in your assessment in BC and Yukon considered cumulative effects with respect to wetlands.
Yeah, so for the focus of my research, I'm not actually looking at to the cumulative effect, but this is a very important point to bring because when you're just considering one project, you can consider as a not significant impact on wetlands, but when you see the whole picture, you can really notice the actual impacts on wetlands, especially when it comes to placer mining in Yukon. So my research is not focusing on the cumulative effects, but of course I will bring this to the study, and this is a very important point because if we are considering for looking just into silos of project by project, and you're not considering the other projects involved, we will still be losing wetlands, right? So And this is really a big issue in Yukon because this been going on for years.
Thank you. Question for Eve, actually. Your presentation spoke to, I believe, two sets of criteria, what you referred to as process and substantive criteria. Apologies if this was covered and it didn't quite sink in, but can you maybe explain the difference and how those two sets of criteria would be applied in your framework? Like, what's the difference between the two?
Sorry, I didn't understand your question. Which criteria?
Oh, apologies, I was speaking to you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you didn't have process and substantive, that would make sense. Yeah, for sure, I didn't cover it, but very good call. If you haven't spent, hours and hours and hours poring over sustainability assessment frameworks, I can totally understand why that wouldn't be immediate. So basically, the process features are guiding the overall process. They're things like life cycle assessment. And to be fair, I have actually taken components from my process criteria, moved it into my substantive, and then moved it back. Because there are some things that really do tie into both lists. As I did mention in my presentation, a lot of other authors, they choose to just create one list and they put process and substantive features into that. My process features, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the next generation assessment. It was published in 2020, I think. It was on my presentation. And so that's really, it's kind of best practice for sustainability assessment. And those are things related to the process of sustainability assessment. I know I'm using process a lot. I'm not really sure if I have another word for that. Substantive is really like the basis of the assessment. What are the most important considerations? These are things like a systems perspective, like maintaining socio-ecological integrity. I'm sorry, I'm going for examples right now because I'm not sure how to make this more clear, which I should be. And so basically, like some things like Indigenous rights and authority, I do currently have it in my process features. It's been moved into my substantive features because I do feel like it's a foundational criteria of sustainability assessment. But really, if you look at the description that I have in it, I talk more about how to apply it at the process level, like who should be included, how you should go about those assessments, like what co-governance would look like. So that relates a little bit more to the process. Does that make any sense? Okay. It's really the foundation of my thesis. I should explain it better, but.
Okay, thanks. So I think we'll just take two more questions in the mic and then we'll break for lunch. So.
I have two questions. Sorry to keep everyone from lunch. We can cut short if that's fine. This is the first questions for Guillermo. Based on your work, do you think that the different EA legislation and the EIS report requirements make a difference in the results that you found? For example, the less specificity in one versus the other, like the two jurisdictions? Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, the environmental impact statements, they're more comprehensive studies with much more information, and the evaluation reports in Yukon are written by the designated officers. So there's a big difference in the information, and now I'll get to the point to compare the two processes, but I haven't done that so far. But yeah, it makes such a difference, and I think looking at it now, and I think context is not an excuse for poor quality EA, but I still have to go for my second part of research and have the different perspectives from interviewees to see other issues and a lot of why questions, and yeah, but it's you can see that from the results it's totally different information that they provide.
Do you mind, just in the interest of time, if we just go to the last question, just because we're a half hour and I'm supposed to keep us on track here. So thank you very much.
I feel bad a bit.
No, it's okay.
I just wanted to say that I'm hoping you're gaining inspiration from our presentation to incorporate Indigenous worldviews in future work on this project, and perhaps even access our toolkit. I'm speaking to the road expansion and both projects actually. I'm not sure what treaty land that these projects are on. I guess I was like curious to know your Indigenous consultation, as it wasn't really mentioned. But I also seen in the presentation, you mentioned a lot about the vegetation and stuff. So I wanted to make a suggestion. If there isn't consultation with Indigenous people, not only from you guys, but like all proponents, then maybe things like having a seeding bank for some of the vegetation and holding on to those seeds for mitigation purposes would be something that you could do like in the lease if you're not engaging with Indigenous communities and seeing how they would like to see those mitigation processes happen. Because like, again, like I said, if you are doing these engagements, there are people that want these projects done. I'm sure this community wants that. And so I'm really curious to know also what the community, sorry, I can't pronounce them, Mushkegowin. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to know like, if you are doing training for that community so that their community members can participate in the construction process and stuff, or was it just engagement? Yeah, okay.
You'll just ask for a
Pretty
quick
packed.
comment over here, and then if
Sorry.
anyone wants to comment, then I'll close things up with a quick comment. And that's how much.
So, we did have Indigenous community consultation during the project. So we sent out, and it wasn't anything very intensive, I'll be completely honest with you. We, as the P3 partnership, we support MTO and IO with their consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities. So that was kind of our role. What we did was that we sent out letters and to a variety of Indigenous communities for study milestones. And then during construction, though, we did have archaeology that was ongoing, or I should say during design and construction. Archaeology reports were also sent for review. And then we actually had Indigenous community monitors on site when the archaeology was ongoing. We had quite a few sites that we had to conduct the archaeology for. And then we also had an unknown site that kind of creeped up during construction that we had to do archaeology for. And we had communities, representatives from 6 nations, from the Sagas of the Credit, and also the Haudenosaunee. And we also have environmental monitors from the Indigenous communities on site during construction. And they've also been involved in some other oversight during construction as well.
And how long do you think the construction will take once it's actually started?
So it started, what was it, 2019? And we're anticipating construction. The majority of the construction is going to be over at the end of this year. There will be a few remedial things in 2023.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to plant that like idea of like a seed bank for proponents when they're doing this, and just also training for Indigenous communities so we can be part of the employment that is coming out of these projects. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we have quite extensive community engagement consultation. It was, where there were a lot of people on the team, but also employed through the feasibility study to contribute to that. So it was, we had community meetings, including feasts, which were great. There was ceremony at some of the events we were at, which was really special for us certainly to be a part of that. There were focus groups. There were, with groups of all ages, from elementary school up to elders. There were elder interviews, and certainly looking ahead, we're at a pretty early stage. But one of the key questions we were asking, I think it ties to the sustainability issue, is how can we make this project the best it can be? I mean, Mushkegowuk Council is representing their First Nations. This isn't someone else coming in to propose this project. It's the project that they're interested in doing. So, it's not funded right now, but it's like, we need to address the concerns that were raised, and how can we make this an exceptionally amazing project for everyone and make sure that the concerns that are raised are addressed, and that there's, the benefits are accrued back to the community. So it was a big part of the discussion, and much more to come, of course. So thank you for those questions, and thank you everyone for your attention and carrying on a little bit. Just I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel for some great presentations. And with that, we're now on lunch break, so please take a stretch. And I'm sure our panelists here would be happy to carry on the conversations over lunch break or later on today. Thank you very much.